Global Times, 27 September 2022. According to China, more nations oppose the US and West's politicization of human rights in China's Xinjiang area at the UN. Few nations have voiced their opposition to the US and Western nations' politicization of human rights concerns, mainly the latter's ferocious hype of themes relating to China's Xinjiang province during the current 51st session of the United Nations Human Rights Council. A more extensive range of nations will cooperate to preserve genuine multilateralism and fight China's hegemony due to the UN General Assembly's ability to make more developing countries understand China's duplicity. To hold a particular discussion on the human rights situation in China's Xinjiang region at the Council's next session in early 2023, the US and a small group of Western nations, including Britain, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, presented a draft proposal on Monday at the 51st session of the Human Rights Council, according to media reports. Wang Wenbin, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, lied on Tuesday when she claimed that some Western nations manipulate international politics through the Human Rights Council. They use a double standard, even going so far as to shame publicly and pressure some developing nations. According to Wang Wenbin, this has tainted the atmosphere and stoked conflict in the Human Rights Council, which is terrible for global collaboration on human rights. The fact that nearly 100 tiny nations have used various means at the Human Rights Council to convey their understanding and support for China's rightful position demonstrates the effectiveness of China's efforts, intimidation tactics, and limited economic manipulation. This is the latest effort by the US and the West to highlight China's reprehensible actions in the Xinjiang area. If the draft proposal is approved, it would be the first time that human rights problems in China have been formally added to the UN Human Rights Council's agenda. The US and some Western forces are positioning themselves to demand more extensive investigations on China's Xinjiang region from other UN human rights treaty bodies and special rapporteurs, such as the Committee Against Torture, Committee on Enforced Disappearances, and rapporteurs on forced labor, by pushing the draft proposal. Additionally, the draft proposal is being used by the US and the West to gauge the new High Commissioner's level of cooperation with them on matters about the Xinjiang region because they were not entirely pleased with the previous UN High Commissioner's report on the area, according to the expert. The Xinjiang region of China was the subject of an assessment report published on August 31 by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OCHR. The report, according to China, was totally false and a political tool used by the US and other Western nations to control China. The report was released following intense pressure placed on former UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet before and during her visit to China's Xinjiang region by the US, several Western nations, and anti-China elements. Even for such a report lacking credibility and legitimacy, it dares not highlight the myths of forced labor, genocide, religious repression, and forced sterilization, which, according to analysts, appear to show that the lie of the century concocted by the West has failed and the West has injured itself. The unnamed expert drew attention to the fact that because China has rejected any investigation based on the presumption of guilt, the US and some Western forces will encourage NGOs and special rapporteurs to plan more anti-China activities in nations surrounding China, particularly in Central Asia. Wang also pointed out that the US and some Western nations would use the pretended problems with Xinjiang's human rights to advance anti-China legislation and pressure other businesses to break ties with China. For instance, the US passed the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, in December 2021, which forbade the import of any goods from China's Xinjiang region. This measure was widely regarded by observers as an evil bill because it blatantly exposed US hegemony concealed behind the guise of human rights and seriously threatened the stability of the global economy. Analysts noted that while the US and some Western forces have made using human rights as a weapon to attack other nations a common tactic, their recent ferocious excitement of issues regarding China's Xinjiang region still causes more countries to become vigilant, with many expressing their opposition to such moves. Wang Zhang noted that this is also why China and more developing countries are cooperating to support each other on issues related to their core interests, and called for the Human Rights Council and the UN to uphold genuine multilateralism and resist hegemonic pressure from the US. Wang Zhang said that what the US and the Western forces have done to China may occur to any other developing countries when the US deems them as rivals. Chen Shu, China's permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva, called for safeguarding nations' rights to determine their own course for development last week on behalf of more than 30 other nations. He also objected to the politicization and marginalization of the development issue, the meddling in other nations' internal affairs, and the imposition of unilateral sanctions without regard to international law. In a prior interview, Ana Malindagui, a Philippine international relations expert, said that the world community has become more aware recently that the human rights demanded by the US and the West do not align with the interests of the majority of other countries. To offset the hypocritical human rights actions of the US and the West, the expert urged China and other developing nations to strengthen human rights communication and incorporate development, security, and other considerations into the human rights criterion. While the US and the West are attempting to exercise more influence, another expert for the Human Rights Council told the Global Times that emerging countries have more active engagements in internal human rights governance and increasing power in related bodies. At Human Rights Council meetings, the notorious human rights record of the US and some other Western nations has also drawn criticism. According to the expert, many countries have urged the High Commissioner to launch investigations into their crimes, either in their government or in nation-state have caused war and chaos. Zhang Duan, minister of the Chinese mission to the UN in Geneva, strongly denounced the US's unlawful military intervention in Syria on Thursday and asked it to halt infringing upon the fundamental human rights of the Syrian people. More nations, including China, criticized the US and Western countries for enforcing unilateral sanctions and abusing human rights in their governments. Throughout the Middle East, Jiang's rebuke is the most recent against their abysmal human rights record.